What in the world is water mitigation? I've spent the past decade within this beautiful space building my own damage restoration company with my father from 0 to 8 figures. I built Albi, which is an industry-leading water mitigation software platform. Wrote the book Restoration Millionaire, which is the industry's best-selling restoration-specific book. Lead the Evolve Restoration Mastermind, which is 50 to 60 water mitigation restorers that meet every single week on bettering the industry. And I do a lot of things within this space. I'm very passionate on iterating within the space. But a lot of times when I try to explain to people what water mitigation is, I keep banging my head against the problem of I don't know how to explain it quickly. So I decided to shoot this quick video to basically explain my take on what water mitigation is. Now, if you're new to the industry, this is the video to watch because it'll give you the entire scoop on what I've learned in the past 10 years of experience on this specific niche. If you're an industry veteran, you should still watch this video because I'm gonna unpack a bunch of things that I've seen world-class restoration companies deploy. You can also feel free to share this video with new employees so that way you could rapidly get them acquainted to the industry. Also stay till the end where I unpack the 5 biggest myths within this restoration space. Let's dive in. So the first thing is, what in the world is water damage mitigation, and what's that term? What are we trying to mitigate? And the concept is rather simple. Water can get into unwelcome places within commercial and residential properties, and this could happen because of rainstorms, polar vortexes that bust pipes, faulty plumbing systems and faulty HVAC systems. And anytime you have water that kind of creeps into unwanted spaces, it causes this damage. The fun part about water is that it causes more and more damage over time. And what water damage mitigation contractors do is they mitigate the risk of further damage. So check this out. If you have a clean water supply line that floods this room, the studio that we're sitting in here right now, if we get in here and suck up all that water and do our work as water mitigation contractors, we don't have to remove anything. So the damage doesn't really occur to the drywall or the carpeting or anything in here because it's clean water and we're able to evaporate it. So if we let that same water loss sit for as little as 48 hours, we can start getting microbial growth like mold and stuff like that. And then we have to cut everything out and remove everything. So the role of this specialty trade is to basically prevent further damage. And these contractors have thousands of pieces of equipment, air movers, dehumidifiers, and specialized crews that their whole scope is to respond as quickly as possible, just like a fire department would respond, extract the water from the unwanted spaces, and install drying equipment to prevent further damage to these properties. The reason these companies operate 24/7 is, again, 48 hours can make a huge difference. 24 hours can make a huge difference on whether or not this loss is large or small. And the reason they're called mitigation contractors is they're mitigating further damages. On the mitigation front, I've had, thousands of success stories. So for example, I had a homeowner who had a burst pipe in a 20,000 square foot basement. This was a massive mansion and he had a beautiful basement, right? We're talking about beautiful tile floors. He had a sauna, he had a ping pong table room, a movie theater, and so on and so forth. And we were able to get there and work across the night and basically pump out all this water, establish the specialty drying equipment, and we dried his entire basement up within 3 days. The cost of that was $60,000, but we avoided what would have been a $750,000 project had he sat for an extra 24 to 48 hours. So I hope that kind of paints the picture of why we respond so quickly and why the term mitigation exists. Now, going over industry stats real quick, and these are going to be at broad ranges because the reality is nobody holds the source of truth on the industry. But building in this space, I've done a lot of studies. I've talked to a lot of people that have looked and sliced and diced the industry. And we know for a fact there are between 30 to 100,000 restoration contractors within the space. And there's between $80 billion and $236 billion of property insurance claims that happen every single year related to water and fire damage. So it's a rather large space, even though a lot of people think it's small. Now, the fun fact about the industry is that the volume has been growing year over year. Here's the deal. Mother Nature isn't really cooperating. And we're starting to get really cold temperatures and warm environments like Tennessee and Texas and all of the South, right? And these houses weren't really built that way. So up in Chicago, where I'm from, right, pipes for water mains and stuff like that are buried like 3 to 4 feet under the ground below this thing called the frost line. We have these things called ice and water barriers on the roofs that prevent ice dams from occurring and such. down in the South, they never really engineered houses with those things because they never really predicted that temperatures would start to freeze. But now we're starting to see snow in, cities like Dallas, for example. And when that happens, that's on the rise, and there's a lot more water damage that happens. Now, obviously, hurricanes are getting stronger and stronger, and natural disasters are happening as well. We see the wildfires within California. We see hurricanes hit, the entire south of the United States. But it's not just disasters that drive this industry upwards. Overall, we have a lot of old structures that, have old pipes and such that, burst all the time. If you really think about it, anytime a plumber, which is a very common trade that everybody knows, goes out to a property, chances are that there's water in unwanted spaces and a restoration contractor needs to come up. But for whatever reason, the plumber is Mr. Popular and the restorer is really not that well known. Now, the other interesting part about this industry is the fragmentation. 30 to 100,000 restoration contractors scattered all over these hyper-local markets. It's not like healthcare where you've got like Blue Cross Blue Shield that dominates the space. It's a very fragmented market with a lot of mom and pops. And actually, until about 5 years ago, there hasn't really been much consolidation happening in the space. I was actually speaking with Jeff Moore. He is one of the presidents of ATI Restoration. Him and his father started that business way back in the 90s. And 5 years ago, it was very uncommon that a restoration company would actually buy another restoration company. Now, private equity has been moving into the space, but they've only scratched the surface and consolidating things. And most restoration companies are small mom and pop shops doing $1 to $2 to $3 million a year in a very hyper local market. Now, the thing that's interesting about this industry is there's low barriers to entry. You don't really need a sophisticated licensure or anything. It takes about $100,000 to $200,000 of startup costs to get a van and some equipment and be able to hit the ground running. And you could run a Google ad campaign and get work within the first 1 to 2 weeks. In fact, I invested in this one restoration company that we went from contract signed to the first job in like 2 weeks. And we're talking about equipment, everything all shipped and ready to go and configured. So there's very low barriers to entry in this industry, but that comes with a con that a lot of restoration contractors end up plateauing. And there's these interesting plateaus. A lot of people struggle to get to their first million. Then there's another plateau around 3 million of revenue. Then there's another plateau around 5 to 7 million of revenue. And very few actually make it past the 8 figures mark. And if you actually look at the industry itself, like there's a small percentage of the restoration companies that make it super big, like the ATIs of the world that got close to $1 billion of revenue. And most restoration companies kind of fall in that $1 to $5 million of revenue mark. Now, as far as workflow for a mitigation division, a lot of times you'll find restoration companies, they do more than just mitigation. So just looking at mitigation alone, they're typically, dispatching somebody right away to a loss, right? What a loss is called a job. And that person's going out there evaluating what needs to be done and putting together what's called the scope of work of what needs to be done. And then typically, like the process is something along the lines of they will pump out the water or extract the water. So if you have a basement with like 2 feet of water, they'll pump the water out, they'll extract, and that's like the first process. And extraction, think of it like a fancy shop vac that's sucking out the water. Then afterwards, the second step is they'll manipulate all the personal belongings or contents within a space. So think of, the chair that I'm sitting at in the studio, for example, will need to get moved out of the way. So that way it's not sitting in this quote unquote affected area. The next thing that they'll do is remove affected building materials as needed. So if the carpet and the drywall and the cabinets are super damaged, and if it's dirty water, for example, like sewer water, all of those things will need to get removed. So the technicians will go out there and remove everything, cut everything up. And then afterwards, the fourth step is they will clean and sanitize the area. So they'll go in and, if it's sewer water, they'll pressure wash the entire floor and the walls, and then they'll apply an antimicrobial, which is like a broad spectrum disinfecting solution to clean that area. And then the last phase of the process is they'll install drying equipment. So they'll install dehumidifiers to basically dry the air, and then air movers, which are like fans, and they basically move the air around to dry. And that equipment will sit there for a couple of days to actually dry out the property. And then they'll come up and pick up all their equipment, and then the water mitigation portion of the job is done. Now, a lot of restoration companies might have multiple divisions. If you're interested more in learning about that, we actually have a What is Damage Restoration video in the link below where you can learn about all the different facets of what a restoration company could have. Now, as far as margin profile, the good part about water mitigation itself is its high gross margin. So the average restoration contractor will spend about 33% in direct job costs to a specific mitigation job, leaving them with about 67% of gross profit. Now, keep in mind, there's a high CAC or customer acquisition costs related to this. There's typically overhead like a shop and a bunch of other stuff. So on average, like a mitigation only company is only spitting out 20 to 25% EBITDA margins, which is like net income at the very bottom. But that's kind of what mitigation companies look like as a whole. Now, as far as org chart and how I see the ideal mitigation company being built is you typically have technicians that are helpers to lead technicians or crew chiefs. And typically the way I see a unit is a crew chief and a technician that ride along in a truck, and they're the people that actually do the work. So the trucks are all equipped with air movers, dehumidifiers, everything that they need. There's a crew chief that knows how to do all the work, and a technician that's the helper of that specific crew chief. Then you'll typically find a project manager. A lot of times in the industry, they're called project managers. I think we should call them in-home salespeople because typically that's the role of the project manager. They're the first responder that goes to the homeowner's home and guides them through the process of what to expect and signs this contract of the work that needs to be done. Then a lot of times you'll find, dispatchers or customer service reps within a mitigation organization. And those people, their main responsibility is to answer customer calls, take in all the leads, and then dispatch out the crews and the project managers to do the work. And then another interesting role within this mitigation space is the estimator role. And the estimator's job is to basically put together the bill of all the work that was done. And a lot of the restoration companies in the industry, they use this platform called Xactimate to bill everything. And then all of those individuals typically roll up to like an operations manager or a department manager or a general manager. And a lot of times the owner kind of services that role. And that's kind of what an org chart of a restoration company looks like. Now, the last thing I want to dive into is customer acquisition profile and how restorers get work. And typically, restoration contractors get work from a variety of different places. And most restoration contractors plateau because they go into dabbling into all the different areas and customer acquisition channels, but they don't go deep enough. But there's a bunch of ways restoration companies can get work. One of the most powerful ones, at least even in the early beginning, is online marketing. So fun fact, water damage mitigation is the third most expensive keyword on Google, and the other two are malpractice attorneys and auto incident attorneys. So, there's a huge market for getting work through online, and there's a lot of lead generation providers that have started producing leads through that. So there's that one. Then there's referral-based marketing. So a lot of restoration contractors, the beauty of this space is there's a lot of different people that find out about the water loss first. So if you think about it, if your toilet was to be overflowing right now, the first person you'd think to call is actually not a restoration contractor. You'd probably call a plumber. So plumbers are a really good referral source for restoration contractors. And then if you think about calling your insurance, you typically don't call the 1-800 Allstate or State Farm line. You typically have an insurance agent that you call. So because the insurance agent is the first person you're calling, that could become a really great referral source for the restoration contractor and a customer acquisition channel. There's also a small percentage of the industry, and I'll dive into this in a little bit, that operates in this managed repair or third-party administrator model, and it's very small. It's about 10 to 15% of the industry where the insurance companies actually refer the contractors directly. There's also property management referrals and, local real estate referrals, social media, and a bunch of other channels that restorers can use to bring leads to their business. Now, what I want to dive into next, and I may or may not get canceled for this, is the biggest myths within damage restoration. And this is a spicy perspective that I have that I've kind of formulated over the past 10 years within the space. Ready? Myth number one is actually the concept of dry logs. This goes way back when, but there's a lot of nerds in the restoration space that love geeking out over these things called psychrometrics. And they've come up with this standard of how to measure relative humidity and moisture content, and all these different psychrometric terms. And there's this big, I'd call it fad in the industry for dry logs. And restorers believe that having dry logs helps them get paid by the insurance company better. And the concept's actually good and valid, right? because the majority of a restoration contractor's bill is determined based on the equipment that's sitting there for how many days, right? So you have air movers that are billed at $27 a day. You have dehumidifiers billed at like almost $200 a day, and they're sitting there. So the restorer wants to fill out dry logs, and it became this industry standard, let's call it, to fill out these dry logs to track your psychrometrics. Now, the problem is, and I know this for a fact, is I seldom see true dry logs. It's all bullshit. Like, literally, the amount of graphs that I've seen of dry logs that are up and to the right, meaning the property's getting way more wet and then the insurance company is paying for it anyway, like that's a more common example than actual real dry logs. So what I want to bust is the myth that you need dry logs to get paid, and that's an absolute myth. I've seen, actually, my personal restoration company, we don't do dry logs. I've seen another competitor that's a world-class restoration company doing multiple 8 figures, almost $100 million a year of revenue within the Chicagoland market, don't do dry logs. We have many customers on the Albi platform that don't do it. So typically it seems like the small restorers kind of adopt this fad because it's the trend and they believe that that's what everybody is doing, and then they start BSing all the numbers and stuff like that. But the one myth I want to debunk here is you do not need to have dry logs to get paid. The second common myth about this industry is, oh, this industry is so small and we are special. Here's the deal. There's 30 to 100,000 restoration companies out there. And the people that feel like it's small and they're special, they think that because they go to these trade shows and industry associations and stuff like that, where there's like 500 to 800 people in the room. And they look around and they're like, oh, wow, this is the entire industry. It's not. Like, there are so many world-class restoration companies, and that's a fundamental problem in the industry, that don't band together within these different organizations, which I think needs to change. But the industry is not small. It is absolutely ginormous, and you are not special. The third myth that is out there is that insurance companies and TPAs control the industry. And all you hear is people groaning and moaning about insurance companies throughout all the groups that you see out there. Here's a fun stat. Contractor Connection and Alacrity are the two biggest managed repair programs in the industry, right? So let's just say they account for at least half of all the managed repair work, because there's other managed repair work that goes through the ServPro networks and stuff like that. I've been to their conferences where they both have claimed less than $1 billion of work that was channeled to their contractors. We know based on this video that the most conservative estimate of this industry is $80 billion. And the highest I've heard of managed repair is somewhere in the $10 to $15 billion range. So that's like 12 to 15% of the industry, guys, of the volume of industry, not claims volume. We're talking about dollar volume flows through these managed repair programs. It is not the gold standard. If you're doing TPA work and you're doing it really well and you're a 100% TPA contractor, right, you're only tapping into a small percentage of the entire industry. And that's a fact. Go do your own research. But most restorers have this perception that like the insurance companies are evil and that they control the entire industry, and they talk about these pains of the TPAs and the auditors and all this stuff. It's not valid. Just look it up. And I get it. There's recency bias, and that's all that people complain about, and all you hear is that, but just look up the stats. It is not the majority of the industry. Now, the reason this is the case is because the insurance carriers haven't mastered this thing called first notice of loss. So as I mentioned before, typically homeowners aren't calling their insurance companies right away when something happens. They're calling the first person to help. If your house catches on fire, you're not calling Geico. Like, you're calling 911 and the fire department's coming out, and then the fire department's referring the restoration contractor, right? If your house floods, you're not calling Geico. You're calling a plumber to take care of the pipe that's gushing water all over the place, right? So because of that, the insurance companies actually don't have as much power as we perceive for them to have, because they're not the ones that get the first notice of loss. We restorers get the first notice of loss. The fourth common myth is that you have to use Xactimate. Again, might get canceled for this too, but here's my full scoop on it. Xactimate is an awesome, incredible product. It was created by James Loveland back in the 80s to transcribe his chicken scratch as a contractor into these estimates. I am an Xactimate certified trainer, know the ins and outs, love the product, right? Worked and trained, thousands of restorers on how to use the platform. But I am here to tell you that the biggest myth in the industry is that you have to use Xactimate. Because I've coached dozens of restoration contractors that did not use Xactimate. They put together their bill, got paid in full by the homeowner, got paid in full by the insurance company without using Xactimate. So not saying use or don't use Xactimate, but if you subscribe to the belief that you have to use Xactimate and there's no other way, that is a false belief. And I just want to bust that myth right now, right here. And the fifth common myth is that insurance is the only way. It kind of ties into the TPAs. And ladies and gentlemen, it actually is not. There are 8-figure restoration companies that do restoration work cash on delivery, or they'll finance the work, or they'll find other creative ways to have the homeowner pay them in full, and they don't subscribe to this whole game of playing telephone with insurance adjusters and stuff like that. So insurance is not the only way. And get this, the house, the home, or the property is probably the most valuable asset of the purchase or the decision maker's lives, right? So if you look at a house, right, most Americans, most of their equity or most of their net worth is tied up into the home that they live in, right? So that's fact number one. Let's just imagine a world where insurance just blew up. There's no more insurance companies. It's all gone. It's doomsday, right? Well, that would not prevent the water damage or the fire damage from happening to these homes, right? Like the water doesn't look at whether or not the property has an insurance policy by your favorite insurance company. The water is going to happen regardless, right? And the homeowners would not fix that because, again, it's their most valuable appreciating asset in the world. The average consumer has purchasing power of like $20,000 to $30,000 to $40,000 to go buy a depreciating asset called a vehicle, and they happily go to the local Chevy dealership and walk off the lot with their Suburban. And that thing depreciates. So if push comes to shove and they need to fix their home, i.e. an appreciating asset that they live in, spend their entire lives in, there's an emotional attachment to it and so on and so forth, and they need to fix that home after water damage or fire damage, whether or not there's insurance involved, it's going to happen. And they have the purchasing power and there's financial tools that could be used to do that. So if you're sitting here and looking at the fact that insurance companies are losing money and the insurance ecosystem's changing, that is a fact. But that does not mean that the work that we do as restorers is going to go away. We as restorers still serve a greater purpose. We're not insurance restoration contractors. We're property restoration contractors. We're water damage mitigation contractors, and we need to understand that that's who we are. That is the 5 biggest myths. Comment below what was your number one takeaway. Hopefully I opened up some eyes of those industry veterans that clicked on this video and watched a one-on-one video, and now we're blown away. Hopefully I don't get canceled for making the 5 biggest myths known to the public now, but there they are. And if you like this content and want to hear more, please subscribe and give a like here, as we are very committed to propelling the restoration industry forward here and just sharing different viewpoints on our lovely little industry here. Talk to you guys soon.